Greetings all, Ferrariman601 here. Welcome back to another 1/400 scale diecast model aircraft review of this by Gemini Jets in their Gemini Max line, the Lockheed C-5M Super Galaxy. This aircraft is absolutely enormous. And why is it absolutely enormous? Well, it has an absolutely enormous role to play. The United States Air Force, it is one of the largest air forces in the world, and it is the air force of one of the largest militaries and one of the most capable militaries in the world. Militaries have a lot of things to do anywhere in the world, often at a moment's notice. They have a lot of people, a lot of supplies, a lot of support equipment, a lot of supplies in terms of food, medical equipment, you name it. The military is using it, and they need to bring it to anywhere they may be needed in the field of battle. Therefore, an aircraft like the C-5, it has an enormous role to play in keeping that military supplied, and therefore it has to be rather enormous in order to do that efficiently. This is the largest military aircraft that is currently flying, and it is the second largest military aircraft ever to enter active service on a regular basis. It is longer than an Airbus A380. It's a little bit lighter than an Airbus A380 in terms of maximum takeoff weight, but dimensionally, it's quite comparable to the largest passenger jet ever produced, and, well, this thing is about 50 years older than the Airbus A380, so big-time engineering, large-scale aircraft, they're a little bit older than 2010. We'll say that much. But this aircraft, absolutely an important one in terms of the defense assets of the United States of America, and it's an absolutely great one in terms of Gemini Jets in their production of it in 1/400th scale. Let's take a look at this 2019 release from Gemini Jets in their Gemini Max line. That's their line for military models of this wonderful C-5M Super Galaxy in 1/400. Before we take a closer look at this model, let's take a look at the box from whence it came. Coming in from screen right, here we go, the Gemini Max Box, as we can see. Obviously, Gemini Max is the product branding that they place for all of their military aircraft, so this C-5 quite obviously is a military aircraft, therefore it gets the Gemini Max line, and as you can see, the Gemini Max Box is basically the same as we always see from this particular brand of the Gemini Jets lineup. Rendering of the aircraft front and center on the top panel, quite obviously. The rendering is, I want to say it's about the same size as the model itself, which is always pretty cool to see. Nice detailing there on that graphic as well, and of course it does match the markings on the model. Up at the top, though, made for collectors by collectors, trademarked quite obviously. And then here we go, Lockheed C-5M Super Galaxy. And then we have our information in terms of where this aircraft comes from. Joint Base San Antonio in Texas. Very cool. 1/400 scale die-cast model aircraft as always. And then replete with our look inside cab there in the bottom left. Bottom panel of the box, there we go, 1/400 scale die-cast model with the selling points and the Gemini Max logo once again down there at the bottom. One of the openable side panels, this is the right-hand side panel. When looking at the box from the top and right side up, Gemini Max, 1/400 scale die-cast model. And then our item number, GMUSA 089. When they do these military models, they do have usually the a three-letter abbreviation of the country that the aircraft represents. So this one, Gemini USA, quite obviously. And then another rendering of the aircraft, much smaller, Lockheed C-5M Super Galaxy. Top panel, Gemini Max, as you can see there. An all-collectible model. Warning, contains small parts, not suitable for children under 14 years of age. Item number there, once again, with our barcode. And then here on our left side panel, the openable panel, we can see rendering of the aircraft, Lockheed C-5M Super Galaxy. And then we have got ourselves this inventory number from the distributor. That's not something that you get if you buy them direct from Gemini. This came from a third-party distributor. And then Gemini Max again with our item number and all of that. The look inside tab. If we do look inside, we see the void, and there's the tray and everything that the aircraft sits in. And then up top, we have got our typical write-up of this model, and you can see that we actually have quite an extensive lineup. We have 3 whole paragraphs here. They have a lot to say about this aircraft. Lockheed C-5M Super Galaxy. And this reads, if you could see it there, not quite sure, but we shall read it. Conceived in the early 1960s, the United States military forces had a requirement for an outsized transport aircraft that would replace the current fleet of C-124 and C-133 propeller transport cargo types. In the end, there was a big battle between Boeing with their 747 offering and Lockheed with what would be the winning bid for the C-5 Galaxy in September 1965. Ironically, the loser, Boeing, would have a far more lucrative sales success with their 747 in the civilian market despite losing the military bid. During the development of the two types, their huge size would test many aspects that were never seen in aviation before for mass production. There were no current engines available that could handle the weight and size of the new transports, so power plant manufacturers were just as busy in their own developing of an engine capable of the task. The first C-5A model Galaxy rolled out on March 2, 1968. Flight tests commenced later that year on June 20th. The massive size of the Galaxy was instantly impressive, and most had never seen something so large lift off the ground so gracefully. In June 1970, the first airlift wing to receive the Galaxy was the 437th at Charleston Air Force Base in South Carolina. Early on, the Galaxy unfortunately experienced severe development cost overruns that were the subject of many congressional hearings and investigations. Despite struggles with the Galaxy and L-1011 TriStar civilian programs, Lockheed made good on maintaining the programs. Lockheed produced 81 of the initial C-5A transports through 1976. In July 1982, the U.S. Congress approved the purchase of 50 additional units that were an updated version of the Galaxy, referred to as the C-5B. Deliveries of the C-5B started in January 1986 and were completed by April 1989. Starting in 1998, a program commenced for a cockpit upgrade to bring the Galaxy to much more modern avionics standards. The final chapter of the Galaxy's development commenced in the mid-2000s for a re-engining program. Identified as the C-5M Super Galaxy, the aircraft features much improved General Electric newer technology CF6-80C2 engines that offer far more performance and efficiency. The Super Galaxy completed development testing in August 2008. In January of 2017, the last of the C-5B models were removed from service, awaiting their conversion to C-5M standard. This means that the United States Air Force fleet is now all C-5Ms. The last aircraft under conversion to C-5M standard will be delivered during 2018. So obviously this was written before 2018, but there you go. Specs here, Lockheed C-5M Super Galaxy. The aircraft type is the Lockheed C-5M. Serial number is 500-0107. Registration is 86-0021. The engines are 4 General Electric CF6-80s, and this particular airframe was delivered to the United States Air Force in C-5M spec in December of 2016. Maximum takeoff weight on the C-5M is 920,000 pounds, the cruising speed is 518 miles per hour, and it has a range of 5,695 nautical miles. Here in schematic view, you can see the aircraft here from the port side as well as from above. Length is 247 feet 1 inch. The height from the bottom of the main gear to the top of the tail is 65 feet 1 inch, and our wingspan here is 222 feet 9 inches. That is quite a long story about the gestation of this aircraft, and those are some quite impressive specifications about it as well. This thing is big, but it has very good reason to be so. Some more detailed specifications now on the C-5M as we see it here. We're going to go straight to the source, the United States Air Force. This is a big airplane. No way to get around that. And why is it such a big airplane? Well, militaries are big things. There are a lot of people, a lot of equipment, a lot of support equipment, a lot of personnel, a lot of support personnel, a lot of stuff that goes into planning a military operation and in executing it as well. And because militaries will operate basically anywhere in the world whenever they may be needed, well, they've got to get there, and they've also got to get all their stuff there. So that's where an aircraft like the C-5 comes in. The U.S. Air Force, they call the C-5M a strategic transport aircraft, and it's the largest currently in the United States Air Force inventory. It's actually the largest military aircraft that's currently flying. Now, it's not the largest military aircraft However, that honor goes to the Antonov 225, which was flying for the Soviet Union in the 1980s. However, that single AN-225 is no longer a military aircraft. It's now doing commercial cargo transport duties. So the C-5 is the largest military aircraft currently flying anywhere in the world. And of course, it's the largest currently operated by the United States Air Force. The C-5M, as the box told us, it's a modernized or modified version of the original C-5 and C-5B specs that came along in the 60s and 70s, but in terms of dimensions, it's the same. Maximum takeoff weight and range, that has changed from the initial variants of the C-5 due to that re-engining campaign at the end of the 90s and through the mid-2000s, as well as the avionics upgrades and everything, adding a little bit more flexibility and cross-range capability and cargo capacity to this aircraft in terms of weight. But dimensionally, the aircraft is as it appeared during its development phase in the end of the 1960s. What does the aircraft have? Well, what does it not have is probably a better question. This thing is absolutely enormous, outside and inside. The main distinguishing feature of this aircraft is the absolutely huge payload bay that it has. Basically, the entire fuselage section is hollowed out. They call it a flying warehouse in the Air Force because it is absolutely enormous in terms of what this thing has in terms of cargo capability. The thing has over 30,000 square feet of cargo space, and of course that's going up in 3 dimensions, so really I should say cubic feet there, but it's just basically all hollowed out inside. There is an upper deck, obviously, for the cockpit, and there's a small passenger compartment in the forward section of the fuselage as well, and by small I mean it can hold 80 people, but largely the aircraft's role is cargo transport, and it does that all through the main section of the fuselage. How do you get into that cargo compartment? Well, the whole nose, you can see these shut lines here. Nothing's openable on this model, but you can see these shut lines going across the nose. The entire nose of this aircraft swings forward and upward in order to expose the completely hollowed out and empty main fuselage of this aircraft, completely hollowed out and ready to accept whatever they can throw at it. It's absolutely enormous. Also facilitating this cargo capacity in terms of loading and unloading, that nose landing gear, you can see that we have 4 wheels on the nose landing gear alone on this aircraft. The struts that those wheels are connected to the suspension system for the nose gear, it can collapse, allowing the aircraft to kneel on the ground so that when that nose is opened up and the cargo bay exposed, they can deploy ramps out the front of the aircraft, and then they can literally drive vehicles on and off of the airplane. It's absolutely impressive to see something like that, and I'm sure that there are plenty of videos up on YouTube showing C-5 operations. It's absolutely wild. Specifically, though, the aircraft is classified by the Air Force as an outsized cargo transport. So, in other words, things that are either too large or too heavy or just too unwieldy to be transported by land or by sea, they're going to be putting them on an airplane like this to get them over the continents and over the oceans quicker and probably a little bit safer as well if you're talking about security concerns. Of course, the aircraft is produced by Lockheed Martin. The engines, as we mentioned, they are the General Electric CF6s. The Air Force designates those engines as F138 GE100, but they are the same CF6 engines that you'll see on a host of airliners, including the 747, which was the direct competitor to this aircraft in terms of that military contract tender. Overall thrust available at sea level at toga power, 51,250 pounds per engine. So multiply that by 4, and of course, standard atmospheric temperature and pressure. That gives you your performance figures on takeoff. Wingspan, 222 feet, 9 inches. Overall length, 247 feet, 10 inches. And the height, 65 feet, 1 inch. The cargo compartment, it is 13 feet, 6 inches high. It's 19 feet wide. And it's 143 feet, 9 inches long. So, this means that you could almost have had the Wright brothers' first powered flight at Kitty Hawk inside the cargo bay of the C-5. Not quite, but you get closer than you might expect. That is absolutely wild. And remember, we're only talking about 50, 55 years since the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk when this aircraft was being developed. So you can see just how quickly technology absolutely exploded in the 20th century. We have 36 pallet positions in that cargo bay, and that can make up a maximum cargo weight of 281,001 pounds there. Maximum takeoff weight is 840,000 pounds. That's a little bit higher than most variants of the 747, and it's a little bit lower than the 1.2 million pounds maximum takeoff weight for the Airbus A380, despite the aircraft being dimensionally longer anyway than the A380 is. Maximum speed is 518 miles per hour, and then this gets really interesting. How far can we take something? Well, apparently, the Gemini Jets box, we have a discrepancy here. They said that the overall range was 5,695 statute miles. The Air Force says that the range is 5,524 statute miles, or 4,800 nautical miles, and that's assuming that we have 120,000 pounds of cargo on board. Completely unladen and just full of fuel, the aircraft could fly for 7,000 nautical miles per the Air Force. But we also have aerial refueling capability on the C-5, which means that, in theory, our range is basically undefinable because fuel no longer becomes our limiting factor. The limiting factor then turns into the engines. How long can those engines run without needing to be shut down and cooled down and serviced? And how long can the crews stay up there? How many crews are on board to relieve each other so that they can keep flying the airplane? How much food, how much water they have on board? But if you can fulfill those requirements, in theory, the aircraft's range is limited by its engine endurance in terms of their maintenance cycles. So that is pretty remarkable. And of course, there are many other military aircraft that theoretically fall in that indeterminate range category due to aerial refueling capability. In terms of flight crew, we will typically have one pilot, one co-pilot, two flight engineers, and that's required to fly the airplane. In addition, we will have a number of loadmasters on board. The Air Force says that 3 loadmasters here would be the minimum requirement, but I imagine that that may change from mission to mission depending on how much cargo and what type of cargo is that they're carrying at that point. The aircraft obviously can carry vehicles. It can carry other aircraft in that payload bay as well, but mainly you'll see armored land-based vehicles being carried by this. Occasionally you might see some light nautical landing craft, some light boats being carried by this aircraft. Also, though, in the 1970s, there was a scheme, and there actually was a test flight, at least one of that we know of, where the aircraft carried the Minuteman ICBM, the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, the solid fuel Minuteman booster. And that scheme was dreamt up by the Air Force in the event that there were some sort of nuclear attack against the United States. They thought that a lot of the ground-based launch sites may be compromised by an initial strike before that we would have the chance to respond. So they had the idea of, why don't we put a couple of these missiles on a C-5, have them flying around with SAC, Strategic Air Command, and if we ever did get hit or we ever saw stuff coming, we could launch these missiles out the back of the C-5 and then they'd be onto their target. And then effectively they'd be untraceable as well because you have an aerial launch of a missile. You can't possibly trace its origin because the launch pad is constantly moving as well. However, one test flight happened. They did have a successful launch of the Minuteman missile from the back of the C-5. They literally just threw it out the back of the airplane under parachute, and then the rocket motor ignited and took the missile wherever they sent it to go on that test flight. But the program officially was scrapped. Do we still have C-5s carrying aerial ordnance? You better believe we do. Do we know about it officially? No, we do not. But I guarantee you that it is happening out there. But yes, overall, going back to the specifications, it is a big airplane, and it has a bigly important role to fill, and it's been filling it for the last 50 years, and is probably going to continue to do so for quite some time to come. Returning to the model itself, though, what have Gemini Jets given us here in this Gemini Max release? Well, this is a 2019 release by Gemini Jets, so it is pretty new, and it is pretty indicative of what the manufacturer from Las Vegas is able to give us these days. And I've got to say, they have done an absolutely amazing job on this model. It's very quickly become one of the favorites in my collection. Of course, initially you notice the very striking matte gray, battleship gray finish that you see on this airplane, just as we see on many of the Gemini Max releases, particularly of American aircraft. But you can see that paint finish there. It looks absolutely wonderful. It's not terribly reflective, and of course this would be by design from the Air Force to paint the aircraft in that battleship gray. They sort of blend into the sky a little bit, particularly if they're flying into some cloud cover. But also, I would not at all be surprised if on an aircraft this big, that paint has some sort of radar absorption or radar reflection capabilities. Obviously, this is not a stealth aircraft by any means. It's really big, it's really loud, and it's not all that maneuverable in terms of, well, it's bigger than most airliners. But I wouldn't be shocked if there is some sort of defensive countermeasure capability in that paint as well, especially nowadays with the C-5M as we see it here. But anyway, the paint looks very good on this thing. Also, what looks very good on this thing, the landing gear. There is a lot of gear on this plane. You can see that we have 4 nose wheels there. We have 4 wheels and 4 tires around those 4 wheels. And then we have how many sets of main gear? We have 4 trucks there, 4 bogies on the main gear. Not all that dissimilar from something like an A380, but you can see how many wheels we have on there. We have 4 wheels on the trailing edge of those trucks, and then we have 4 wheels on the leading edge of those trucks there. So we have got, no, we've got 4 wheels there on the back, or 2 wheels there on the back. Kind of hard to tell. Yep, 4 on the back and 2 in the front. Okay, 4 times 2 is 12, and then 2 times 2 is 4, and then you can multiply that by 4. Yeah, there are a lot of wheels on that airplane. And why do we have so many wheels on this thing? Well, it's really heavy, 840,000 pounds of maximum takeoff weight. You can understand why you would want to distribute that load so that you don't poke holes in runways and things. Speaking of runways, another reason why this aircraft is the way it is, in particular in terms of the high wing that we have here, this is designed to be flying into battlefields, and you're not always going to have a 15,000-foot absolute pool table smooth runway to come into. So the aircraft with the high wing, with the sort of short and stocky, stumpy landing gear, that's also there, much like it was on, if you remember when we took a look at the Ilyushin 62, why that plane has a reasonably high wing and particularly high mounted rear engines and short landing gear is they were coming into unpaved runways. They wanted a low center of gravity so the plane wouldn't roll over if it happens to hit some rocks on the way down. Same thing here with this aircraft. Obviously, there's more to it because of the high takeoff and therefore landing weight that the airplane can have. But same sort of thing. This thing needs to be rugged, it needs to be versatile, it needs to be able to operate from basically anywhere, including the McMurdo Station in Antarctica, where C-5s have been known to go in the past. So yes, that's why the aircraft looks the way it does. It's also why we have a high vertical stabilizer there as well, with a very high horizontal stabilizer mounted on top of it. Again, not all that dissimilar from the Ilyushin 62, but much larger, quite obviously, and designed for quite a different role. Taking a look at some of the other details that we can see on the model, you can see the nose there with the shut line that shows you where that nose opens up. The whole thing slides forward and then tilts upward by 90 degrees. It obscures the cockpit windows when the nose is open, so don't do that in flight, boys. But obviously you can see what's going on there with the nose, and I like that detail as well. I like this better than I like the interactive series from Gemini Jets in terms of those airplanes have removable sections of fuselage to emulate openable doors and things. The shot lines on those, they just don't look all that good to me, and I understand that it's to make the model functional in terms of opening and closing things, but I don't think it looks right when everything is closed up. So I actually do prefer this to have the details printed on there, but the panels themselves being fixed as part of the model structure, I do prefer this. However, other graphics that we can see. U.S. Air Force title graphics, I guess we could call them. Not quite title graphics, because it ain't an airliner, folks. But I do like that. That's all been rendered very nicely. It's totally legible. The print is clear. No smudging or smearing or paint loss there. It looks good. You can also see the air wing numbers there. And you can also see some patches there, emblems there on the side of the fuselage. I like that an awful lot. It looks good. Toward the tail section of the aircraft, you can see that we have got the roundel of the United States Air Force there moving aft. That looks really good. You can also see the very large shut line for the rear ramp on the C-5 there. Again, very similar to the nose in terms of what that detail looks like with the openable nose section, but on the tail of the aircraft, we also have a big ramp that can open up downward in our viewpoint here from the fuselage down to the ground, and you can see all of the shut lines for that have been printed on there, and of course not openable on this model. But I do like that all the same. Also there, roughly midships, just rears of the main landing gear doors, you can see that we have got these two further openings of some sort. They're printed here on the model, but I imagine they would be openings in reality. I don't know entirely what those would be for. Are they ventilation for that big cargo bay? Are they some sort of exhaust for auxiliary power units or other generators that might be on board the aircraft? Are they actually ports for guns? I don't know. I don't believe that the C-5 carries any sort of air-to-air ordnance. I know that it carries chaff and flares for countermeasures, and I know that it has carried aerial ordnance in the past, but I don't know if they currently still do. I know that the C-130 does, but I don't know about the C-5. Typically, I'd imagine these would be flying a bit too high to be used in any sort of ground attack role, but again, the need for air-to-air defense may still be there, and that could have something to do with that. Would the Air Force ever tell us that? Probably not, but the possibility exists. But again, I do more so suspect that those openings there, just the rears of the landing gear doors there in the main gear, probably some sort of technical detail rather than being associated with any sort of armament on the aircraft. But anyway, it's a cool detail to see. Other than that, though, not too much more to see in terms of the graphics on the airplane, because we don't have any cabin windows or anything like that, because there really isn't much of a passenger cabin on this airplane. But again, it can carry passengers in a pinch, and of course, in theory, it could carry as many as 850 people, maybe even 1,000 people. If they really needed to load this thing up with personnel, it could carry quite a lot of people. And in fact, there was an idea, at least in the 60s and 70s, to outfit a couple of these aircraft for civilian commercial use. But the operating costs were going to be too big even before the oil crisis in the 1970s, so that was never really put into action. Pan Am, I think, was interested in maybe doing it, but they went for the Boeing 747 instead. And we know that Pan Am, they were a big driving force in terms of what airline manufacturers were doing. They were instrumental in the 747 and the 747 SP. They were also instrumental in the L-1011 TriStar from Lockheed, so they had a good relationship with Boeing, and Lockheed did Pan Am, but the C-5 never quite panned out for them, although it would have been an utterly ridiculous airliner to see. The size of this thing, unbelievable. Would have been the A380, basically 40 years ahead of the A380. Ridiculous technology that would have been. But I digress. Midships here, you can see the wing. We have that high-mounted upper wing on this airplane, and of course that's to give the engines more ground clearance so that when they are on those unpaved runways out there and who knows where, they're not ingesting FOD into the engines and things like that. Also, having the wing up there gives it somewhat cleaner airflow, not quite as affected by ground effect, I would imagine, which means that short takeoff and landing capability, yep, this airplane has it, particularly it has short landing capability. You've got all those tires on the ground, you have a lot of traction, which also means that you have a lot of brake. So you can get this thing stopped pretty quickly. I don't know what the optimal landing distance on this airplane is, but I'd imagine it's quite short compared to its size. Certainly shorter than any commercial airliner of a comparable size and configuration would be. But nonetheless, you can see the basically the byproducts of making that engineering decision. High wings, high-mounted engines onto the wing, but again, very, very effective in terms of what the airplane needs to do and the design concessions that had to be made in order to enable it to do it. Taking a look at the port side of the C-5M, here we go. First off, toward the nose and cockpit area. You can see those great graphics that we talked about. There they are. They all look good. U.S. Air Force plainly visible there. We have 433rd Air Wing. We have 6021 there as fleet number I believe, or registration number, one of those. It's also there on the tail that we'll take a look at later on. Just taking a look by eye there. But toward the nose section, there is the shut line that we talked about, separating that movable nose panel from the rest of the fuselage. You can see the bump there with the cockpit roof. And in this section here, there is a little bit of a passenger cabin. You can also see that we have got a couple of hatches, one upper hatch here, probably allowing access to the top of the aircraft on the ground for maintenance, inspections, things like that. And then we also have a door here, which could probably hook up to an air bridge if they actually landed at a suitable field that had an air bridge, but I'm sure that this door would most likely not be used during typical operations out in the field. Everybody would rather enter and exit either through here, this side door, or through the nose or the tail ramps if they happen to be open on the ground. However, there you go. Not as much detail to see on an aircraft like this in terms of looking at windows and other graphics, but what is here does look very nice. Here is the port wing. See the wing root here coming in from the top of the fuselage rather than the bottom or generally on the side like we see on most other aircraft, simply because of the design decisions that had to be made here. But leading edge of the wing, you can see that it has this very nice curving profile across the leading edge. It all looks very nice. And of course we have got our two port engines on this side. The nacelles, they look good. Not as much to see on these nacelles as there are on most civilian jet aircraft, simply because of what this aircraft is and what its role is and where it's operating. But you can see that what we do have here graphically is very clean and crisp and clear. And we also have just generally a nice shape of all of this. I do like the silver intake side of the nacelle, and then moving toward the aft, you can see that we have the nacelle cut off, and we just see the center compressor stage of the engine and then the exhaust side of the engine as well. These engines are also reasonably high bypass. Again, they are the same engines that you'll see on the 747-400, for example. Also, the MD-11 flew these engines, and a few other airplanes did as well, and still do. Boeing 757, I think. So lots of cross capability in terms of a lot of the components, which also goes toward reliability of these engines. There are plenty of parts for them, and the cost in terms of producing them. They're making them anyway. It's not like there's some sort of bespoke thing. But they look a little bit different simply because of how they're mounted on this aircraft, and the nacelles, they're being a little bit shorter than we see on a lot of civilian applications there of this engine. But again, the same CF6s. Moving aft, you can see the main landing gear there. All the landing gear, the nose and the main gear, they do roll. Plastic wheels, rubber tires, they all look good. They all roll nicely. No flat spots on the tires. They're all fitting there squarely across the wheels. It all is great in my book. And then moving the rears, you can see how the fuselage starts to taper upward toward the tail cone. There's our shut line for our rear ramp visible right there. Air Force roundel visible just barely there behind a wing tip. Door upper, door lower, whatever this little thing is. Again, I don't think it's a hatch. It's probably an exhaust outlet for something. But there you go. Tail, there you go, tail cone, and then we start to move up toward our horizontal and vertical stabilizers. As we move up, you can see more of that detail. There we go. You can see this very obtuse angle that is basically creating the complexion of the horizontal stabilizer as it mounts to the top of the vertical stabilizer. Not at all dissimilar from the IL-62. Again, a lot of comparisons to be made with the general aerodynamic philosophy of this airplane and the Ilyushin 62. Actually, they were developed concurrently in terms of time frame, but of course, completely different sides of the planet. But very interesting. You can see I like all of that leading edge shut line detail, and of course our rudder control surface, the shut line there, also visible, very nice. The fairing that houses some of the hydraulic equipment for the trim ability of the horizontal stabilizer up there. There's a bit of a tail cone up here as well. And then the horizontal stabilizer itself. On the model, it's all one piece. It's just stuck on top of the tail. So that all comes together nicely, very straight. Nothing is crooked about that, and it all looks very good. And again, the entire model, the wings, the stabilizers here at the tail, It all has this very nice battleship gray finish, and the texture on it is actually quite nice. It's not entirely smooth. It's a little bit rough. It's slightly abrasive. I like that. It's not unique to this model. It's also on the KC-135 that we took a look at, and it's also, somewhat oddly, on the E-4B that we took a look at many moons ago. So interesting that Gemini Jets go that direction with the Max in terms of the paint finish that they use, but it's a little bit more rugged, actually. I like it. It just fits the personality of the subject matter, being military aircraft. I do like that quite a lot. Also, what we have on this airplane, we have got our graphics here on the tail. We have got the U.S. flag, which I've counted. It has 32 stars on it, not 50, but it's there, recognizable as the U.S. flag. We have the Air Force Reserve Command, I believe that is. We have a state ensign, I guess, of Texas. Obviously, it's not the state flag, as it's not a perfect rectangle, but you can see it's basically an ensign of Texas. 60021, and then the small cursive text here, Super Galaxy. That's what that says. Not sure if you can read that there. Maybe a little bit better that way, but I don't know. Super Galaxy is what that says, and I like that. It has a very 50s, early 60s feel to it using that sort of font, but looks good, and again, I do quite like everything that I'm seeing here. It looks marvelous. Take a look from the nose of the C-5. There we go. Zooming in as close as we dare before we start to lose our focus, but there we go. Looking good there. Bring the camera down slightly, and now you can see. You have a very interesting sort of oblong profile cross-section of this fuselage, and of course that's trying to maximize the volumetric efficiency in terms of the space presented in there. This thing is enormous, and it has to carry a lot of oversized and irregularly shaped cargo. So it would behoove them to try and be as efficient as possible with managing their space, and it's part of the reason why we have this rather egg-shaped fuselage. Obviously, the top section here, where the crew compartment is in terms of the cockpit, as well as having room for passengers or relief personnel, that is separate from the payload bay. But below that, so roughly from where you can see the shut line here, all the way down to the bottom of the fuselage, that's all open cargo area on board. So I think it's an interesting shape, very unique. It's kind of reminiscent of the 747 in some regards, but again, it's quite different as well. Moving outboard, we can see our leading edges of the wings. Here's the starboard wing, quite obviously, and there are our engines. You can see relative to the rest of the wing just how far inboard the engines actually are mounted. I mean, they're not asymmetrical in terms of the amount of space that they've used on the wing, but it's an interesting proportion when we look at it in the context of the rest of the fuselage. But there you go. Your two engines there. I like the fan blade detail that is visible in those engines here on the starboard side. There are no pass-through details here. In other words, you can't see through the engines themselves. In reality, of course, you could, but not to the extent of the more modern engines that are currently on airliners. But again, I like the fan blade detail, center hub visible there. That's all well and good. Moving toward the port wing, again, you can see engine detail going on there with our fan blades, and that all looks absolutely marvelous. Definitely enjoying that. Also across the wing leading edges and moving toward the tops of the wings, you can see that we have got these strakes that are coming up from the leading edge of the wing toward the wing root area. Probably a little fairing to cover the shut line and help the aerodynamics a little bit. And additionally, you can see these little strakes coming across the top side of the wing as well from the leading edge here on the starboard wing, and obviously the same there on the port wing. But that's all good. I like all of that, and it looks pretty authentic. Landing gear then visible. You can see the airplane is sitting straight and level here on the ground. We don't have any misshapen landing gear struts or anything like that. It all looks good. And then moving up, there is our proportion with the vertical and horizontal stabilizers. That's good. And that's an interesting looking shadow. I like that. That's cool. There is a very interesting photograph that I have found on Wikipedia. I don't know where it originated, but there's a very interesting photograph of McMurdo Station in Antarctica where they had a couple of C-5s landed. And the C-5 is not the subject of the image. What is the subject of the image is the Superior Mirage, Fata Morgana mirage that happens quite often at these high latitude locations in terms of boundary layers of different air densities, mostly associated with temperature, and you get these very odd looking distortions in the atmosphere, visual optical distortions. And part of the mirage, you can see the tail of a C-5, and it looks very weird, but it's interesting. If you want to take a look at Superior Mirage on Wikipedia, you'll see what I'm talking about. And the C-5 makes a cameo appearance, and you see that tail. It looks really, really strange, somewhat unsettling, but at the same time, it illustrates the actual subject of the image quite nicely. And, you know, C-5's involved, so it's got to be cool. Starboard side of the aircraft now. What do we have? Well, very similar details to what we had on the port side, and even more so because this is not an airliner, so it is going to be more or less symmetrical on both sides. But again, you can see the nose section here with our shut lines here printed for the movable nose panel, U.S. Air Force. And then we do have two emblems below. That looks good. Of course, can't quite get close enough to see them, but they're there. So we've got 6021, 433rd Air Wing. Looks like we have air data ports perhaps right here. Interesting. Also another one here that's silver circle, and then up here this may be probably a window, and this is probably also an emergency cut here for rescue section of that fuselage as well, because again, your passenger cabin would be basically here from the cockpit down toward the start of the wing route here. So interesting to see all of that. Did not see that on the port side. Starboard wing, here we go with our engine, nacelle, and pylon detail. I like the detail that you have here on the pylon right there. I don't know if that's legible, but I like that it's there regardless. Of course, the shapes of the nacelles and the tail section of the engines look good. There's your green strobe for the starboard wing. There was a red strobe on the port wing, quite obviously. And then here we have got another couple of hatches or windows maybe, and then we have got our ingress egress door here on the starboard aft. USAF roundel, shut line for the rear ramp, and then of course going back up we have got ourselves our vertical and horizontal stabilizers here toward the top. Very nice. There we go. U.S. flag once again oriented the opposite way for the starboard side because you can't show the flag in retreat. AFRC, emblem or ensign of Texas 60021, and Super Galaxy all printed there. And another view of the horizontal stabilizer mounting pod, really, I guess we can call it, up at the top of the vertical stabilizer. Very cool. And again, the shut line's visible there, fore and aft on the leading and trailing edges of the vertical stabilizer, replete with your rudder control surface, shut lines there, tail cone moving back, another little black dot there, a couple of them actually moving toward the tail cone. We got a forward one and an aft one. Not sure what they are. I don't know if they're for auxiliary power unit, intake and exhaust or something, but there are details there, quite evidently. But their purpose seems a little bit mysterious to me at the moment. And from the tail here, coming in here, now we can really start to see that relative size of that rear ramp. Have a look at that. That is pretty huge, if I had to say so. And our focus is not quite cooperating here. Got some noise in the image, it would appear. Probably heat, because this camera's been running for a little while. But you can see our shut line here. There we go. For our ramp, that's all pretty big. And you can just see the overall size of this thing that would be coming down from the fuselage onto the ground. And that ramp could actually be opened in flight as well. And often is opened in flight to be dropping vehicles under parachute at the back directly onto the battlefield, if the case may warrant that. So again, even more capability that this aircraft has. Port wing, trailing edge. You can see these little canoe pods that they're often called. They are housing the actuators for our trailing edge flaps and slats. That all looks good. Exhaust sides of the engines here, the port engines, that looks good. You can see the little shut line in Right about this area there, that ring, that concentric ring around that tail cone of the engine. That's the bypass area on the engine. That's good. Obviously, that's visible here on the starboard wing as well. That's all well and good. Same details in terms of the control surface shut lines, also visible here on the starboard wing, and that all looks well and good. Very, very nice. That tail cone, there's more detail to be seen there with these little grills, grates, louvers, whatever we want to call them. I don't know if that is also for ventilation for the cargo bay or maybe associated with an auxiliary power unit back there. Again, not totally up to date with the technical specifications inside this airplane in terms of the sort of running gear that it has. But again, it all looks pretty nice, and Gemini Jets really doing a job on this model. And it closes out with some freehand shots here of the C-5M. There's the nose section, getting a little bit closer than we could with the tripod mount there. You can see we've got our cockpit windows, and we've got some windscreen wipers there, mounted not on the center window, but the two outboard windows there forward. That looks real nice. You can also see that we have got ourselves that painted line between the radar dome fairing and the rest of that nose panel. Also, we've got these two white stripes here. Not quite sure what they're for. I almost want to say that they're some sort of visual indication for the cockpit crew as to the position of the nose to verify that it is actually locked into its flight position. But just speculation on my part. Don't entirely know what that is. We've got this other smaller detail here on the lower section of the nose. Again, not quite sure what that is. Could be an air data port, but again, more speculation from me. There we go. 6021, the 433rd Air Wing, U.S. Air Force. Nice, like all of that. There is our wing root section, and this right here is the only flaw that I can find on the model, and it's minuscule, but you can see there the lower section of the wing root, we have this little indentation in the paint there. Not entirely sure how deep that goes, but that is the only imperfection that I can see on this model. It is very, very nicely done otherwise. Leading edge of the wing, there we go. Engines, and then going out to our wing tip with our red strobe there for the port wing tip, obviously. Upper surface of the wing, and you can see how the wing is put together on the aircraft. For the model's purpose, they are not a cradle arrangement. This is all one piece there. So the wing and the fuselage are on the same, they're the same piece of metal. Very, very cool to see all of that. Upper surface of the wing though, leading edge slats, and then our trailing edge flaps, our ailerons, and then our little fairings there for the flap actuators. Starboard wing, USAF, that all looks good. Starboard engines, obviously. Anti-collision lights up top, some antenna detail up top. Looking good. Up here, there is our receptacle for aerial refueling, and you can see that we've got this pattern here. That must be a range finder for the boom operator on the back of the KC-135, most likely. There we go. Upper section of the aft portion of the fuselage. There are the hatches that we mentioned earlier, USAF roundel, and then we get into our vertical and horizontal stabilizers here in the tail. That all looks good. I want to show the branding here at the back as well. There we go. There's a U.S. flag. Ensign of Texas 60021 Super Galaxy. Hopefully that cursive script is a little bit easier to read now. There we go. Like all of that. Tail cone. Underneath the landing gear, there's your main gear. And again, we've got 2 wheels forward and 4 wheels rear there. Very, very cool. Like all of that. So 6 wheels per truck. 6 times 4. And then we've got 4 wheels up top with the nose gear. Really, really good. Underneath the nose, you can see we do have branding. Air Force Reserve Command, I believe, that is printed there. We can lift the aircraft up. See that a little bit more clearly with any luck. There we go. Very, very nice. Like all of that. Cool. Very, very cool. Also, you can see here perhaps a better proportion of the main landing gear doors. That all looks good. Obviously in the open configuration, but they protrude somewhat from the outboard flanks of the fuselage, like that. And then the wing details we saw earlier. Very, very, very pleased with this model. It's a bit different from the other models that I have in that it is, first of all, it's a military aircraft. I have a couple of them, but I don't have all that many. And just some of the details that are visible on this one are just not things that you see on airliners because, well, it's not an airliner. But all in all, it's very nicely done. Certainly, it's become one of my favorites, and very much would recommend that you get this one. It is amazingly well done. So there it was, in 1/400 scale by Gemini Jets, the Lockheed C-5M Super Galaxy. This model is very quickly become one of my favorites. It is amazingly well done here by Gemini Jets. As a military model, it's a little bit different from what we see from most of their civilian reproductions, but I have to say, it's absolutely tremendous in every sense. It is the largest 1/400 scale model that I have. It is a little bit longer than the Airbus A380, and I believe it's actually a little bit heavier as well. I was somewhat surprised when I got it out of the box for the first time because I knew it would be big, but I didn't quite comprehend how big an aircraft this actually is. I've seen them in reality, but I've only ever seen them in flight and from some distance, so getting a sense of the scale from that sort of perspective is a little bit difficult. But this is a tremendous airplane. It does some tremendously important things for the military, and in 1/400 scale, I think Gemini Jets really conveyed that sense of presence and that sense of importance in the subject matter of this model and their execution thereof. It really looks very good. It is very impressive on display. Again, it's the largest 1/400 that I have. It's really something to behold. A 2019 release as well, so it is basically state-of-the-art in terms of Gemini Jets, and as far as they're concerned with how they're making these models nowadays, they really have done a tremendous job on a lot of their 2019 and 2020 releases, and this one certainly is no exception. In fact, I may call it to be exceptional in terms of being one of the best that they have made in quite some time. It's really great. It's all die-cast. The fuselage and the wings are all one piece. The vertical stabilizer and horizontal stabilizer, they are separate pieces, but they're secured nicely. Everything's straight and level. No problems with the landing gear. No problems with engine nacelles or graphics or anything being crooked. The paint is basically flawless except for that one very tiny chip that we took a look at, but really doesn't detract from the overall presence or presentation of the model at all. Absolutely tremendous. Really have to recommend this one if you want a military aircraft for an airport diorama that you have, or you just want one for the collection. I would definitely suggest that you take a long look at this one, particularly if you're a fan of the large wide-body civil jets like your 747s and A380s of the world, because this thing has a very similar presence to both of them in terms of the overall form factor, but I was even more impressed by this one just because it is such a substantial piece. It's wonderful. No complaints about it whatsoever. Highest possible recommendation I could give. C-5M Super Galaxy by Gemini Jets. You're not going to go wrong with this one. Until next time, though, I do hope that you've all enjoyed this one. Ferrari Mount 601 saying thank you very much for watching, and of course, we will see you soon.